All right, we'll go ahead and get started for our first session of the afternoon here. Delighted to have with us a special guest from Microsoft, Julie Brill, who's Microsoft's Chief Privacy Officer and the Corporate Vice President for the company for Global Privacy, Safety, and Regulatory Affairs. So, very broad mandate and a lot of issues that I'm sure you're worrying about. Julie leads Microsoft's work on tech policy, a lot of regulatory and legal issues relating to questions on data privacy, cross-border data flows. She's been with the company since 2017?
Yes.
But prior to that was one of the members of the US Federal Trade Commission working in Washington, D.C. And so, like many of our speakers and expert guests today, has experience both from the public policy side of the desk and now on the business side of the desk. Julie, this morning's panels, we sort of talked about some of the real pressing policy questions around issues like free flow of data, privacy issues, where there are different standards emerging in different jurisdictions. There are groundbreaking technologies. We talked a little bit about AI this morning, and so those are pushing the frontiers and companies are moving very quickly and the frameworks aren't catching up. So I'm hoping we can talk about some of those issues in our conversation this afternoon. Sure. In Asia, this is particularly important because we're seeing different governments develop their own frameworks. Japan introduced the data free flow with trust policy recently. There's a new digital economy partnership agreement that's pulling together some of the APEC economies, including Chile, New Zealand, Singapore, and most recently South Korea. But we also have other models in the region, like the PRC's approach to data privacy and data security, which really runs counter to a lot of the standards that we're trying to develop in the West. So I'm hoping we can get into some of those questions with you today, Julie. Let me ask you one to begin with. Thinking about your role at the company, and then thinking about your prior role in a government setting, what do you see as some of the big developments in digital data privacy regulation in the US and in Asia?
Sure, absolutely. First, I just want to thank you for inviting me here. It's really delightful to have a chance to be here and talk with everybody. My role is quite expansive. In addition to all the privacy issues that I work on, I also work on digital safety. I have a team that does digital safety, do lawful access and national security regulation, as well as regulatory governance and corporate standards. So it's quite a wide remit and also really fascinating because of all the connections between these different issues. So when it comes to like where are the regulators going, where are policymakers going, let me talk a little bit about the US and then a little bit about Asia. We obviously at Microsoft have a very big presence in Asia, and while we are based in the United States, we're very much a global company, and so we very much focus on the regulatory issues that are going on around the world. So starting with the US, I think what we're going to see, I think the trends that we're going to see will be, there will be, I believe, AI regulation, AI rules that will be developed in the United States, but they will be different in this coming administration from what we saw in the past administration. I don't think there will be, and this is not really news to anybody, but it's worth saying, I don't think there will be quite as much of a focus on safety of AI. There will be more of a focus instead on security, in particular security vis-a-vis global trade of advanced technologies. So I'm sure you've already talked about that. That I think will continue. There was an executive order that the Biden administration issued around, it was called AI diffusion, but it was really about the diffusion of the advanced technology, not so much about the apps in the higher level, but really the advanced technology that allows for very advanced forms of foundational models and things like that. I think we will continue to see that regulation, either in the form it's in, well, probably not in the form it's in, it will probably be redone, but it will be pretty significant and immersive. I think we will also see in the United States a support for infrastructure around AI. I think data centers, permitting, electricity or other power sources will be deeply supported because of their importance for building AI and for ensuring that the United States I think it's very open and everybody knows about this. This administration really wants the United States to be the leader in AI. And so the infrastructure that's necessary to make that happen, I think will be supported and will be built out. I think it'll be interesting. I mean, there will be competitiveness, obviously, with China. So that will be a theme that will also be quite prevalent in the United States in terms of the regulatory approach. The thing I want to mention, though, which probably a lot of people don't think about in these forums, is that the states in the United States are also quite active regulators and policymakers. So before I was a commissioner at the U.S. Federal Trade Commission during the Obama administration, I spent many years at the state level in the United States working for attorneys general. I was a deputy attorney general doing consumer protection and competition work. I did it in Vermont for many years and then in North Carolina for a year before the Obama people called me and said, hey, how'd you like to become an FTC commissioner? I was like, okay, that sounds cool. So the states in the United States will legislate. They do not have the same problems or benefits, depending upon your perspective, that you see in Congress in the United States. They actually do pass laws, and they pass a lot of them. So I think what we'll see is probably more safety regulation happening at the state level in the United States. That'll be California, Colorado, Oregon, probably Connecticut. Those are the ones that have passed immersive privacy laws, and they'll be motivated to focus on AI. So I just, it's always important to me to mention that, in part because of my background, but also in part because I think the international community doesn't often get that, like, there's two layers, at least two layers in the United States of how regulation is done and is formed. Really quickly to round out the U.S., I think we will see at the federal level digital safety regulation. I think, you know, the Take It Down Act, which the Senate just passed, which deals with non-consensual intimate imagery and other types of deepfakes and real pornography and other horrible images that happen online and that are non-consensual. I think we'll sort of see that kind of regulation at the federal level. We very well may see some federal laws around children as well, social media and children. And we will see all of that at the state level too. Okay, turning to Asia, and I'm also super happy people want to talk about Europe. I deal a lot with Europe too, as you can imagine. I kind of feel like there's three themes in Asia. The first one is that Asia is varied in its approach. Unlike what I would say you find in Europe, where you kind of have this central body, the European Union, that drives a great deal of regulation. In Asia, we don't see that. You talked about some of the initiatives that are trying to make that happen, and I think that's true. Just in privacy, for example, you know, you have Australia, Japan, Korea with very long-standing privacy laws, very immersive, very mature within their nation states. And then you have India and Indonesia that are, in many ways, to their benefit, starting now. You know, they started it a couple of years ago, but they are building out their privacy infrastructure, regulatory infrastructure now. So you don't really have centralization at the member state level, and instead you have just this disparate approach, which is completely fine. You know, it's something that I really enjoy learning about and making sure that Microsoft will do well in all of those environments. And of course, we are very engaged, you know, in India and Indonesia and elsewhere, Vietnam and another area where privacy laws are being built out. We very much want to engage to help the policymakers understand what we've seen elsewhere, what we see works and doesn't work, and that kind of thing. So that's one issue that we see in Asia. I think another, keep going, I just got two more issues? Okay. The other issue, one other issue that we're seeing is there is a strong theme throughout Asia in terms of the regulators. They're very focused on how individual personal data is being used in AI. And at the same time, they're not rushing in to adopt regulation yet. And we think that that's a good thing. What we see is that the regulators really want to learn. They really want to understand, how does the technology actually work? How can we understand the different layers of the tech stack? I don't know if you guys talked about that this morning, but that's actually like a really important thing to understand. And then where does it make sense for regulators to come in, and where does it make sense for regulators to let the market go? So we're seeing a lot of engagement. Singapore is a great example. Singapore's regulators are very active on the global stage, and they are very interested in learning, and they want to move forward, I think, but they're not moving forward super quickly because, again, they want to get it right. Okay, the last thing I think I'll mention in terms of the themes in Asia that, you know, our teams are seeing is there is a desire to simplify, harmonize regulations so that individuals and small and medium businesses will understand better not only how they comply, but also what is happening to their data. And some of this has to do with the way in which the economy runs in many Asian countries, where a lot of it happens not only through small and medium businesses, but also there's a lot of cross-border activity as well. The simplification theme is also playing out in Europe. As many of you probably know, the Commission is working on a simplification process, and I'm happy to talk about that. I think that what's happening in Asia is actually, again, kind of, it's similar, but it's also happening in an environment where there isn't as much immersive regulation yet. And that's, again, part of the caution that we're seeing in regulators to sort of say, like, we really want to get this right, and we don't want to overburden small and medium businesses. So we think that that's goodness. I mean, a company like Microsoft, we can manage anything. I mean, if it's manageable, we can figure it out. It's really our customers, many of whom are small and medium businesses, that have more difficulty, and we see that.
I'm glad to hear your optimism, because just hearing you describe a multitude of different regulatory environments in Asia, the contrast between a US federal one and the EU's GDPR, and then the potential of 50 different states reaching 50 different conclusions. You've hinted at, I think, a preference, and I'd like you to sort of go a little bit deeper down this path, Julie. What are some of the best approaches that public policymakers could take to achieve that harmonization or simplification? Because even if you're sitting here and saying, I'm confident at Microsoft we can manage these challenges, for smaller companies, this is a huge burden. And so how do you begin to bring these different regulatory frameworks together in ways that achieve all of the protections that policymakers are trying to achieve, while also providing the freedom for business to do what it needs to do?
So it's a really interesting question, and there's two ways I can answer it, and maybe I'll talk about both perspectives. One is from the perspective of the regulators, like what do they want to do to try to harmonize? And I've got a couple of examples that I think will be interesting. Then there's what do companies do? So did you have a preference of which goes first? Okay. Let me start with the companies. So one of the things that we're working on, and my colleague Tom Robertson is sitting over here, and he's a great partner in these initiatives. We're working very hard on trying to understand the ways in which regulations, if they go up a level, actually have a lot of similarities. And how do we develop governance systems that can adjust and can be modified, tweaked, if you will, turning the dial up or down as different regulations are passed? And as you think about it, there's actually a lot of similarity between, for instance, privacy and digital safety and responsible AI and even security. You know, things like impact assessments. I mean, the content isn't necessarily the same, but around the world, regulators are looking for companies to do impact assessments, not only so that the regulators can, if they need to, understand how companies are viewing the risk, but also just to make sure that companies are going through that exercise. I mean, the DPIAs, the data protection impact assessments that are part of GDPR, began that process. It's called perhaps privacy by design, where companies really have to sit back and think immersively about what they're doing. You're seeing the same thing in digital safety, safety by design. You see the same thing in AI, responsible AI by design. And I think this is goodness, actually, for everybody, for the companies, the companies that want to be trustworthy, which is actually something that's very important to Microsoft, but also, you know, to everybody to know that companies have to sit back and actually think about what they're doing and describe it. There's nothing more important from my perspective than making sure that our engineering leaders and business leaders go through that exercise in all of these important domains. So you see impact assessments, you see other issues that kind of run across all of these domains that make them similar and indicate that you can build infrastructure. Another area is data subject rights. That's something that becomes important in lots of different domains, where basically users get the ability to see their data. That also runs across. So you build infrastructure to build out these kind of risk assessments. You build infrastructure to build out what you need to do to surface individual data, and that is something that you can use across the different domains. So that's something that actually I lead at the company with lots of great partners, again, like Tom and others. I think it's going to be where technology companies need to go. I think we're a little bit early in this, but when I talk to some of my peers at Google and Meta and elsewhere, they're like, yeah, we're doing the same thing. We're just getting started. So it's just a trend to talk about, to be aware of. When it comes to the government side of harmonization, I'll tell two stories real quick. One, in Europe, I have a very dear friend who's at DG Connect. She's very high up, and we're close enough that I can say to her, like, what are you guys doing? So about 2 years ago, I kind of asked that question, and I said, there's all these different laws out there. I mean, EU Act, GDPR, the DMA, the DSA. Sorry, that alphabet soup, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, and the EU AI Act, among others, all were adopted in the last mandate. I said, during that last mandate, the last year or two, how are you going to harmonize all this? How are you going to bring all this together? Her response was, we were too slow in regulating before. We missed the boat on social media. And so our first priority was passing a bunch of laws. She said, in the next mandate, we will harmonize them. And I said, okay, so we get a pass? We don't have to comply? You're like, oh, no, you still have to comply. So that's the way the European Union was, or some people, the way some people at the European Union at the Commission level were thinking about things. And that's all, you see that happening now with their simplification process. That's one story. The other story is when I was at the state AG offices and the states were passing data breach notification laws. So it began in California. Now every state has a law, and that process took about 15 years. And there was a lot of concern within Washington, D.C. about, hey, these laws are all different. We can't do it. Small and medium businesses can't do it. How do we know, what we should be doing in terms of notification about breaches in Illinois, if it's different from New York, things like that. And over time, the states actually harmonized the laws themselves because we realized at the state level, again, this isn't the federal level, but at the state level, like if a little state like Vermont or a big state like California, had a separate law that was actually California, leave that out, Illinois and Vermont. Because California is going to do California. They're going to do what they do. But for, Illinois and for Vermont and for North Carolina, it was really hard if they had one piece that was actually different. So now all of the laws are actually the same. They modified themselves over years. Now, was that painful? Was it painful for businesses? Was it even painful for the policymakers? Probably so. But I do think, because I have both the mind of a regulator and the mind of a company, compliance and regulatory person, I do think that regulators get these issues and they do want to solve the problems. Sometimes it's just hard to find a path quickly.
So let me stay on that theme,
Sure.
Julie. Thank you. Our panel just before lunch was looking at export controls, and one of the panelists made the comment that, with the pace at which AI is evolving, we're having conversations today that we couldn't have imagined having 5 years ago. And where AI goes over the next 2, 3, 4 years, we probably can't imagine the kinds of conversations we'll be having then. Do we have the luxury of time in this new environment where AI is driving so much of the growth in the digital and data space for this gradual process of harmonization between different regulatory regimes to begin to come together?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would sort of answer that yes and no. It sort of depends on what type of regulation you're looking at. And again, it also depends on where in the tech stack you are. So to the extent that you're talking about the core infrastructure of AI, you're talking about data centers, you're talking about land permits, things like that. Given the timelines that are required to build all of that, I think that's actually something that if you're going to regulate, like you can't regulate it midway through a project. Like you can't be midway through a data center and suddenly learn that you actually have to do something completely different for the infrastructure of that building. So somewhat counterintuitively, I actually think that those are the areas that need to be dealt with first and get harmonization around permitting and around building out. And on the other hand, those are also issues that are localized. A data center is a data center. It's like a house, but it's much bigger and does a lot more for the world in many ways. You can have different rules, but between, say, Washington State and Florida, you can have different rules there. But my view would be that policymakers, governments should move quickly on what they want to do, because otherwise you will have confusion and people won't want to invest, or they'll start an investment and then things will change, and that would be very hard. Whereas at the app layer, the top of the stack, once you get to the data center and you get to the cloud platform and you get to the models, I'm going up the stack, the foundational models, and then you get to the fine-tuned models, and then you get to using these models to build out apps, top layer. I actually think that there's more fluidity. It's kind of like all the other regulations that we actually in many ways, all these regulations we've dealt with in different ways, just not in the context of AI. I do think at that very top layer, it's a little bit like social media or what we want to do with kids. And as we see things change and needing to change, I think policymakers can change along the way. It does require more harmonization, though, oddly. So I think you can take longer, but the harmonization is going to have to be there, because global companies or small and medium companies, when they build an app, they don't want to build different apps for different states. I mean, you can, whether it's member states or countries, you can, and certainly that happens. But the efficiencies really come when you have sort of one approach. So it's sort of, I'm doing this off the top of my head. I haven't really thought deeply about sort of slow versus fast, and what really leads to harmonization and what needs to happen. But I do think, just like everything in the context of AI is not just one thing. It's many things. And I think what I see regulators, especially in Asia, doing is really trying to understand that. And that's goodness. And so I don't think there's just one answer to that question about AI.
Thank you. I'll ask one last question before we have a few more minutes to open things up to the audience. And it's a two-part question. Yeah. You said you've worn these two hats, government, regulation, private sector. What's the one thing that you wish the private sector would pay more attention to? Yeah, that's, sorry, that's part one. That's part one. Yep. That it's not really thinking about from a regulatory or safety perspective. Part two, if you could get policymakers to understand one business reality that your Microsoft Julie Brill thinks about every day, what's that?
Okay, so this is much easier than your last question. So the one thing that I really want companies to be thinking about that want to deploy AI, and I talk to customers about this, I go to events to talk about this, is you cannot engage in safe and trustworthy AI within your business unless you have strong data governance. Strong data governance is key. And that means you understand your data, you're tagging your data, you have appropriate controls over who can see what data. And I'll give a really quick example because I hear we're running out of time. Imagine that you have an AI, a co-pilot, and your co-pilot is being used by everybody in the company, and you've got someone, you know, who's an everyday worker who wants to find out what everybody's salary is. Now, that might not be something that you might share that as a company, but you might not. And if you don't want people to be able to understand what everybody's salary is, that means you have to have that data, that HR data about what people earn, appropriately tagged, appropriately controlled, and have access controls so that the AI won't respond to everybody who asks that question, just to people who have access over it. The AI basically follows, our co-pilots follow that. If you have access controls over data and certain people can't see it, then the co-pilot will abide by that. But if you don't have those access controls, it can be a mess. So that's the one thing, super important. We provide tools that help companies do this. It's real, I think, like, you do that, you're about 95% of the way there. The rest is easy. So that's what I really want companies to do. I think there are two things, sorry, not one thing, that I would really want governments to do, and it's actually what we've already talked about. Regulators do need to take the time to understand the technology and understand the complexity. I also think companies need to help regulators understand, and we spend a lot of time at Microsoft doing just that. That's a big part of my job, going around the world, talking to regulators, explaining the tech stack, explaining the kinds of regulations that we've been thinking about at these different layers, whether it's licensing at the data center layer or at the app layer, whether it's just sort of the normal type of privacy, digital safety, security regulations that we already have. So understanding the tech stack, working with companies that want to help are super important. And then it goes back to the complexity issue, like trying to get harmonization so that you're not overburdening small and medium businesses for whom this regulatory landscape is getting increasingly hard.
Thank you. Unfortunately, Julie has to run right at the half hour, so probably got time for a couple of quick questions. If you have one, if you could raise your hand, introduce yourself, and ask a brief question, and we'll let Julie try and respond to that.
It was so crystal clear, right? There we go.
Gentleman here. Wait 1 second for the microphone to come to you.
I'm Mark Cheong. I realized that this has kind of been addressed partially already, but again, with what we were talking about in the last panel, where we most likely cannot imagine the state of AI in the next 3 to 4 years, is it worth it to try to harmonize in the moment or in the near future if the technology itself is going to change so much?
You mean harmonized regulations?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, taking a different cut at this question than I did when you asked something very similar, I actually believe in regulations. I believe regulations, just generally speaking, are important for building trust. I think the problem with regulating AI before you actually know where it's going and what it will do is you could sort of kill it, you know, before it ever blossoms. I do think it would be a different approach from my perspective that might be better would be really focusing on skilling, really focusing on how to ensure that individuals are ready for where AI is going. Because there will be changes in jobs. There will be changes in the way in which we engage with technology, the way people earn money, the way society actually is built. And so rather than regulating what you don't know, which I think is just a mistake, as I've been mentioning, rather than doing that, getting society ready for it and also investing in it as you think is appropriate and maybe trying to shape, governments can also do a lot to shape the technology. I think that that's a better approach from an investment perspective, from a training perspective, rather than a regulatory perspective.
Thank you, Julie. Any more questions from the audience before we wrap up this session? Okay, one right here.
Hi there, John Verwey with PNNL, one of the DOE labs. You mentioned a need for industry and business to educate the regulators a little bit better. As you're no doubt well aware, a lot of that is done through technical advisory committees and federal advisory bodies. That process seems pretty slow given the pace of change in a lot of technologies. Curious if you have thoughts on better ways that are, with the times to educate regulators.
It's a great question. I was asked that question. I was doing a forum in Paris with lots of companies, and I had talked about the fact that I had just visited with the CNIL, the French privacy regulator, and one of the people there who was from a very, very large French company said, "We don't get access to the CNIL," which I thought was interesting. They did want to hear from us. And so I do think direct conversation is the best. I think coming in, sitting down, talking about, an issue. One of the things that I spent the last 6 months doing with other people, like Tom, who focus kind of on product issues, they were working with us and other folks were working with us. We met with a whole bunch of regulators about what our AI training model will be for user data. We had launched our process in the United States, in Canada, in a few Asian jurisdictions, but not in Europe, because we wanted to wait until we got the nod from the European regulators that this made sense. Okay, I'm going to get a little geeky right now for a moment. The real issue was around, could we use legitimate interest under the GDPR, basically an opt-out system, or did we have to use robust GDPR consent, which is an opt-in system? That's a major fork in how you deal with data that you're going to use for training. And I spoke to the CNIL about this, as I told the French audience. I spoke to, and it wasn't just me, it was our team. The ICO in the UK, because we also paused in the UK, spoke with members of Italy, the Irish, of course, because the Irish are our main regulator, Germany, several other member state privacy regulators, because they're all part of the board, and the board now has even more authority based on recent court rulings that they can overrule the Irish or whoever the primary regulator is. But also it was just important that they all know, because the board, the European Data Protection Board, is important. So we went in and we explained what we want to do. And we talked about all the protection. We said we want to do opt-out. We want to use legitimate interest. We think if we can't use legitimate interest for AI, then the GDPR is really broken. You might as well just call it a consent law. That would be all it is. But if you want legitimate interest to thrive, look at all the protections that we're putting in place. We were only going to use forward-looking data. We weren't going to use history. We were going to give users in-product notice 15 days before we ever started using their data. We were going to have blogs and FAQs and all of this stuff. And no kids, making sure that sensitive information was taken out. We had a whole bunch of protections. If you're interested, you can go to Microsoft, one of our websites, and you can find the blog that describes this. And we not only did the Irish and the board think that this was really great, but they also said that this is now the benchmark of what we're going to use for when companies say they want to use legitimate interest. We're going to make sure they do all of these things. So if you don't have the conversation, You can't get through to the regulators. And it's not like I'm fighting with them. It's saying, I believe in GDPR. I want GDPR in all of the ways that it's supposed to work well. And you have to support legitimate interests. So what are you going to do in the context of AI training? And I gave them these examples and they thought, yeah, this is really thoughtful. This is something that we can endorse. So I'm a big believer in direct contact. I think there's nothing like that at the end of the day. But if you can't do that for a variety of reasons, I do think trade associations can be helpful. BSA, as we talked about, various organizations can be helpful there too. But there really is nothing like the one-to-one. And maybe that's easy for me to say because it's a world I came from and I know how to speak that language. So maybe it's easier, but I think everybody could do it. It's also a little scary. You're taking a risk. You're taking the risk that they'll say, oh, no, not only do we not like that, we're going to investigate you, which would very, very rarely happen.
Well, thank you so much,
Of course.
Jerry. I like your final comment there about figuring out how to speak the same language. It's one of the roles I think we try to play at MBR between subject matter experts, the policy community, the business community, very much sort of the underpinning of a lot of the remarks you've made today. Please join me in thanking Julie Brill from Microsoft.
Thank you.